Part 1. The Sicilian Roots. The story of Joe Bonanno begins not in the shadowed streets of New York, but in the sun-scorched hills of Sicily, where honor was measured in blood and loyalty forged in fire. Born Giuseppe Carlo Bonanno on January 18, 1905, in Castellammare del Golfo, young Joe entered a world already steeped in the ancient traditions of the Sicilian Mafia. His father, Salvatore Bonanno, was a man of respect in their village, connected to the local honored society. The Bonanno family lived according to the old codes: omertà, the vow of silence; rispetto, the demand for respect; and above all, the understanding that a man's word was his bond, sealed not with paper, but with his life. Sicily, in the early 1900s, was a powder keg. The island suffered under poverty and political corruption. The mafia filled the void left by weak government, providing its own form of justice and order. Young Giuseppe absorbed these lessons like water into parched earth. His father taught him that in their world a man stood by his principles or fell into disgrace. In 1908, tragedy struck. A devastating earthquake ravaged Messina, killing over 100,000 people. The disaster sent shockwaves through Sicily, creating chaos and displacement. For the Bonanno family, it marked the beginning of a long journey that would eventually lead them across the Atlantic. But before America, there was the vendetta. Salvatore Bonanno became entangled in a blood feud with rival families. The details remain shrouded in the silence of omertà, but the consequences were clear. The family had to flee. In 1911, when Giuseppe was just 6 years old, they escaped to America, seeking refuge in Brooklyn, New York. America promised opportunity, but for Sicilian immigrants, it delivered discrimination and hardship. The Bonannos settled in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, among other Sicilian families who had fled similar circumstances. Young Joe attended school, learning English while his father struggled to establish himself in this strange new world. Then came another twist of fate. In 1915, Salvatore Bonanno made a decision that would shape his son's destiny. The family would return to Sicily. The old feuds had cooled, and Salvatore believed his place was in his homeland. For young Giuseppe, now 10 years old, this meant an education in two worlds, the American dream and the Sicilian reality. Back in Castellammare, Giuseppe continued his studies. He was a bright student, sharp-minded and observant. His family enrolled him in a nautical institute, hoping he might pursue a legitimate career at sea. But Sicily was changing. Benito Mussolini had risen to power in Italy, and his fascist regime declared war on the mafia. Mussolini appointed Cesare Mori as prefect of Palermo with a singular mission: crush the honored society. Mori was merciless. He arrested thousands, tortured suspects, and imprisoned entire families on mere suspicion. The iron fist of fascism struck hard against the old traditions. For families like the Bonannos, who had connections to the honored society, life became dangerous once again. In 1924, 19-year-old Giuseppe Bonanno faced a choice. He could stay in Sicily and risk Mussolini's persecution, or he could return to America and build a new life. The decision was made for him when his name appeared on lists of suspected mafia associates. Salvatore arranged for his departure. Giuseppe Bonanno arrived in America for the second time in 1924, but this time he came alone. He carried with him the old Sicilian values, the codes of honor his father had instilled, and a determination to succeed in this land of opportunity. He had no way of knowing that he would become one of the most powerful crime bosses in American history. and that he would outlive nearly all his contemporaries to die peacefully in his own bed at age 97. He entered America during Prohibition, perhaps the greatest gift the U.S. government ever gave to organized crime. The Volstead Act had banned alcohol, creating a black market worth billions. For young Sicilians with connections and courage, bootlegging offered a path to wealth and power that legitimate business could never match. Giuseppe settled once again in Brooklyn, reconnecting with the Castellammarese community. These were his people, immigrants from his hometown, who shared his values and understood the old ways. Among them were men who would become legends: Stefano Magaddino, his cousin who controlled Buffalo; Joe Profaci, who would build his own criminal empire; and Salvatore Bonanno, a Castellammarese boss who would play a crucial role in Giuseppe's rise. But young Bonanno was patient. He worked legitimate jobs while building relationships within the underworld. He studied his new environment, understanding that American crime was different from Sicilian traditions. Here there were Irish gangs, Jewish mobsters, and Italians from different regions, Naples, Calabria, Apulia, all competing for territory and profit. The stage was set for the Castellammarese War, a conflict that would reshape the American Mafia and elevate Giuseppe Bonanno, Joe Bonanno as he became known, into the pantheon of organized crime bosses. Part 2. The Castellammarese War. The late 1920s brought prosperity to those willing to break the law. Bootlegging transformed street criminals into millionaires, but with wealth came conflict, and in New York's underworld, conflict meant war. The battle lines were drawn between two powerful bosses, Joe the Boss Masseria and Salvatore Bonanno. Masseria, a Neapolitan, controlled much of Manhattan and had ambitions to dominate all Italian criminals in New York. Bonanno, from Castellammare del Golfo, like Joe Bonanno, led the Sicilian faction and refused to bow to Masseria's demands for tribute. Joe Bonanno found himself pulled into this conflict through blood and geography. The men of Castellammare stuck together, bound by their shared origin and distrust of the Neapolitans and Calabrians who served Masseria. Bonanno, now in his mid-20s, had proven himself capable and trustworthy. Bonanno took notice of the young man's intelligence and adherence to the old Sicilian codes. The Castellammarese War began in earnest in 1930. Bodies started appearing in the streets of New York. Masseria's men hunted Castellammarese associates. Bonanno's faction struck back. The violence escalated through months of shootings, bombings, and disappearances. The newspapers called it a gang war, sensationalizing the bloodshed while understanding little of its true nature. Joe Bonanno served as a soldier in Bonanno's organization. He participated in the conflict, though he would later claim in his autobiography that he avoided unnecessary violence. Whether true or not, Bonanno survived when many others did not. His intelligence and caution served him well in those dangerous times. The war reached a turning point in 1931. Masseria's own men grew tired of the endless conflict and the old boss's greed. Among them was a young, ambitious gangster named Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Luciano saw opportunity in the chaos. He secretly reached out to Bonanno, proposing a solution. He would betray Masseria if Bonanno agreed to end the war afterward. On April 15, 1931, Masseria was lured to a restaurant in Coney Island. After lunch, while playing cards, 4 gunmen entered and shot him dead. Luciano, who had been dining with Masseria, conveniently stepped away moments before the shooting. The killers were never officially identified, though underworld sources pointed to Joe Adonis, Albert Anastasia, Vito Genovese, and Bugsy Siegel. Masseria's death ended the Castellammarese War. Maranzano emerged victorious. He called a meeting of all the Italian gangsters in New York and declared himself boss of bosses. He reorganized the Italian underworld into 5 families, a structure that would endure for decades. The Bonanno family, the Colombo family, the Gambino family, the Genovese family, and the Lucchese family. Maranzano appointed Joe Bonanno at just 26 years old to lead one of these families. It was an extraordinary honor and a testament to Bonanno's reputation among the Castellammarese faction. He was young, but he was respected. He understood the old traditions and had proven his loyalty during the war. But Maranzano's reign as boss of bosses was short-lived. The old Sicilian had underestimated the younger generation of American-born gangsters like Luciano. These men had no patience for the strict Sicilian hierarchies and titles. They wanted a more businesslike approach to crime, one that emphasized cooperation and profit over ancient feuds and rigid traditions. Maranzano, paranoid about potential threats to his position, began planning to eliminate Luciano and other powerful bosses. But Luciano learned of the plot. On September 10, 1931, just 5 months after Masseria's death, 4 men posing as police officers entered Maranzano's office and stabbed and shot him dead. The murder of Maranzano marked a watershed moment in American organized crime. Luciano and his allies implemented a new structure, the Commission, a governing body composed of the bosses of the major crime families. There would be no more boss of bosses. Decisions would be made collectively, disputes settled through discussion rather than war. Joe Bonanno faced a crisis. His mentor and patron was dead, murdered by the very men who now controlled the underworld. He was young, leading a family during a time of radical change. He could have been eliminated as a Maranzano loyalist, but Bonanno proved adaptable. He recognized that Luciano's commission was the new reality. He bent to it, attending meetings and accepting the new order, at least outwardly. Internally, Bonanno remained a traditionalist. He believed in the old Sicilian ways, the codes his father had taught him. This tension between appearance and belief would define his entire career. Bonanno consolidated his power carefully. He built his family around Castellammarese loyalists and other Sicilians who shared his values. He avoided the mistakes that had doomed Masseria and Maranzano. He didn't flaunt his power or make enemies unnecessarily. He focused on making money through bootlegging, gambling, and the loan shark business. By 1931, at the age of 26, Joe Bonanno stood as one of the youngest crime bosses in America. He had survived a bloody war, witnessed the murders of 2 powerful bosses, and navigated the treacherous transition to a new underworld order. He would hold power for over 3 decades, outlasting nearly all his contemporaries. But the seeds of future conflict were already planted. Bonanno's adherence to old Sicilian traditions would eventually clash with the modernizing American mafia. His independence and pride would lead to one of the most significant crises in organized crime history. Part 3. Building an Empire. The end of Prohibition in 1933 could have destroyed the American mafia. The illegal alcohol trade had made them wealthy and powerful. Now their primary revenue stream was gone. Lesser criminals might have faltered. Joe Bonanno adapted. He diversified his operations with the methodical patience of a businessman building a legitimate empire. The Bonanno family expanded into gambling, establishing illegal casinos and bookmaking operations throughout New York. They controlled loan sharking operations, lending money at exorbitant interest rates to desperate gamblers and failing businessmen. They infiltrated labor unions, extorting payments from businesses in exchange for labor peace. But Bonanno's vision extended beyond New York. Unlike many mob bosses who focused solely on their immediate territory, he saw opportunities across America and even internationally. He established operations in Arizona, California, and throughout the Southwest. He forged alliances with crime families in Montreal and Haiti. His network stretched from Brooklyn to Sicily. In his personal life, Bonanno cultivated the image of a respectable businessman. In 1931, he married Fay Labruzzo, the sister of one of his associates. They would have 3 sons, Salvatore, called Bill, Joseph Jr., and Salvatore. Bonanno insisted on presenting himself as a legitimate entrepreneur, claiming his income came from a cheese factory and other legal businesses. He lived well, but not ostentatiously. His home in Brooklyn was comfortable, but not palatial. He dressed conservatively in well-tailored suits. He avoided the nightclub scene that attracted many gangsters. This discretion served him well. While other mob bosses drew police attention with their flashy lifestyles, Bonanno operated in relative obscurity. The 1940s brought new challenges and opportunities. World War II created black markets in rationed goods, sugar, gasoline, tires, meat. The Bonanno family profited from these shortages. They also became involved in the narcotics trade, though Bonanno would later claim in his autobiography that he opposed drug dealing on moral grounds. This claim remains controversial. Evidence suggests that while Bonanno may not have personally sold drugs, members of his family were deeply involved in heroin trafficking, particularly the importing of heroin from Sicily through the French Connection. Whether Bonanno directly authorized this activity or simply looked the other way remains debated. Throughout the 1940s and 1950s, Bonanno maintained his position through a combination of ruthlessness and diplomacy. He eliminated threats when necessary. Rivals who challenged his authority simply disappeared. But he also built alliances, understanding that cooperation was often more profitable than conflict. His relationship with other mob commission members was complex. He maintained cordial relations with some bosses while viewing others with suspicion. He was particularly close to his cousin Stefano Magaddino in Buffalo and Joe Profaci in Brooklyn, both fellow Castellammarese. With Luciano's family, later controlled by Frank Costello and then Vito Genovese, relations were more strained. The Appalachian meeting in 1957 marked a turning point. On November 14th, law enforcement raided a gathering of over 100 mafiosi at the rural New York estate of Joseph Barbera. The raid exposed the national scope of organized crime to the American public. Among those detained was Joe Bonanno. The Appalachian disaster had far-reaching consequences. It led to increased federal attention on organized crime. The FBI, which had previously denied the mafia's existence, was forced to acknowledge and investigate it. Congressional hearings followed. The heat intensified on all crime families. For Bonanno, Appalachian represented both a problem and an opportunity. The increased scrutiny made business more difficult, but it also created instability among rival families, and instability created opportunities for those patient and clever enough to exploit them. The early 1960s saw Bonanno at the height of his power. His family was prosperous and well-organized. His sons were growing into men. Bill, the eldest, was being groomed to eventually take over. Bonanno's legitimate businesses provided cover for his criminal enterprises. He owned a cheese factory, a dairy farm, and various properties. But Bonanno's independence and adherence to old traditions increasingly put him at odds with other mob commission members. They viewed him as arrogant and uncooperative. He refused to share certain territories or profits. He made decisions without consulting the commission. His old-world Sicilian attitude clashed with the more Americanized approach of younger bosses. Rumors began circulating that Bonanno was planning something ambitious and dangerous, the elimination of several commission members to increase his own power. Whether these rumors were true or manufactured by his enemies remains unclear. Bonanno denied these plans in his autobiography, claiming he was the victim of jealousy and misunderstanding. What is certain is that by 1963, Joe Bonanno faced the greatest crisis of his criminal career. The commission had grown suspicious of him. His own family members whispered about his leadership. The federal government was investigating him for various crimes. At 58, after more than 30 decades of power, Bonanno's empire was beginning to crack. The old Sicilian had survived gang wars, multiple investigations, and the rise and fall of countless rivals. He had built one of the most powerful crime families in America through intelligence, ruthlessness, and adherence to the codes of honor learned in his youth. But the world was changing. The old ways were dying. And Joe Bonanno, the last of the mustache Petes, who still believed in the Sicilian traditions, was about to face the ultimate test: survival against his own kind. Part 4. The Bonanno War begins. October 21st, 1964. The night that would ignite the Bonanno War and shatter the fragile peace of New York's underworld. Joe Bonanno emerged from his lawyer's office on Park Avenue in Manhattan. He was scheduled to appear before a grand jury investigating organized crime. As he stepped toward the waiting car where his lawyer stood, two men approached. They grabbed Bonanno and forced him into a vehicle. Within seconds, the car disappeared into New York traffic. Joe Bonanno had been kidnapped. The abduction sent shockwaves through the underworld. A commission boss had been snatched off the street in broad view of witnesses. No ransom demand followed. No body appeared. Bonanno simply vanished. Theories proliferated. Some believed the commission had ordered his kidnapping, planning to force his retirement or kill him. Others suspected Bonanno had staged his own disappearance to avoid the grand jury and consolidate support. His son Bill immediately claimed his father had been kidnapped by rivals, though he offered no proof. The truth, as Bonanno would later claim in his autobiography, fell somewhere between these extremes. According to his account, members of the commission, specifically the Magaddino, Gambino, and Lucchese families, had indeed arranged the kidnapping. They wanted to force him into retirement and install new leadership in his family. For 19 months, Joe Bonanno remained missing. During this time, chaos erupted within his organization. The commission recognized Gaspar Di Gregorio, a longtime Bonanno family member, as the new boss, but Bill Bonanno and other loyalists refused to accept this appointment. They insisted Joe Bonanno remained the rightful boss and would return. The family split into two factions: the Di Gregorio group, backed by the commission, and the Bill Bonanno group, loyal to the kidnapped boss. Tensions escalated. Both sides armed themselves. Meetings ended in threats. Former friends became enemies overnight. Then, in May 1966, Joe Bonanno reappeared. He walked into the federal courthouse in Manhattan accompanied by his lawyer and explained he had been recovering from illness. He claimed no knowledge of any kidnapping. The story satisfied no one. Not the FBI, not the commission, not even many in his own family. But Bonanno was back, and he made his position clear. He remained the boss of his family. He would not retire at the commission's demand. He would not accept Di Gregorio's appointment. The old Sicilian had returned to reclaim his throne. The commission faced a dilemma. They had attempted to remove Bonanno peacefully and failed. Now he was defying their authority openly. If they did nothing, it would make them look weak, but moving against him directly meant war. They chose war. On January 28, 1966, before Bonanno's reappearance, the conflict turned violent. Several Di Gregorio gunmen ambushed Bill Bonanno and several associates on Troutman Street in Brooklyn. In what became known as the Troutman Street ambush, the attackers fired over 90 shots at Bill's car. Miraculously, no one died. Bill and his men escaped with minor injuries. But the message was clear. This was no longer a political dispute. It was open warfare. Joe Bonanno's return intensified the conflict. Throughout 1966 and 1967, the Banana War, as the press dubbed it, raged through New York. Men disappeared. Bodies appeared in car trunks and vacant lots. Bombings damaged homes and businesses. The violence was less spectacular than the old gang wars of the 1930s, but more sustained and bitter. The Bonanno loyalists held firm despite being outnumbered. They controlled certain territories and rackets, generating enough money to continue fighting. They also had something their opponents lacked: absolute loyalty to their boss. Joe Bonanno inspired devotion among his followers in a way the commission-backed De Gregorio never could. Federal authorities watched with interest. The FBI had been investigating Bonanno for years, but could never build a solid case. Now the mob was tearing itself apart, creating opportunities for informants and defectors. Agents pressured captured gangsters to flip, offering deals in exchange for testimony. Joe Bonanno recognized the danger. The war was making him vulnerable not just to rival families, but to law enforcement. At 62 years old, he faced multiple federal investigations. His health was declining. He had suffered a heart attack during his disappearance. His family was at risk. Bill faced constant threats and legal problems. In 1968, Bonanno made a decision that shocked the underworld. He would retire, not because the commission demanded it, but on his own terms. He would step down as boss, install new leadership, and withdraw from active involvement in the family's criminal operations. But his retirement came with conditions. He wanted amnesty for his son Bill and other loyalists. He wanted guarantees that the family would not be absorbed by rivals. He wanted respect, acknowledgement that he was leaving by choice, not by force. The commission, exhausted by the long conflict and distracted by their own problems, agreed. Gaspar de Gregorio had proven ineffective. He too would be replaced. A compromise candidate, Paul Sciacca, was appointed boss. Bill Bonanno would not lead the family, but neither would he be killed. In early 1968, Joe Bonanno relocated to Arizona, far from the streets of Brooklyn where he had built his empire. He would claim to be fully retired from organized crime, focusing on his legitimate businesses and writing his memoirs. But was he truly finished? Or was this simply another strategic retreat, like his disappearance in 1964? Part 5. Exile and Investigation. Arizona's desert sun was a far cry from Brooklyn's crowded streets, but Joe Bonanno adapted to his new environment with the same pragmatism that had served him throughout his criminal career. He settled in Tucson, purchasing a home and establishing himself as a retired businessman with interests in various legitimate enterprises. To outward appearances, Bonanno had truly left the mob life behind. He spent his days managing his dairy farm and cheese business. He attended church regularly. He cultivated relationships with local business leaders who saw him as a successful Italian-American entrepreneur, not a crime boss. But the FBI wasn't convinced. Federal agents maintained surveillance on Bonanno's activities. They tapped his phones, followed his movements, and monitored his visitors. Every trip back to New York raised suspicions. Every meeting with known criminals was documented. The late 1960s and early 1970s proved difficult years for organized crime in America. The federal government had declared war on the mafia. The Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, passed in 1970, giving prosecutors powerful new tools to target entire criminal organizations rather than just individual criminals. Joe Bonanno became a prime target. In 1979, federal prosecutors indicted him for conspiracy to obstruct justice. The charges stemmed from allegations that Bonanno had plotted to block a grand jury investigation in the 1960s. At age 74, the former mob boss faced the possibility of dying in prison. The trial revealed much about Bonanno's continued influence despite his claimed retirement. Witnesses testified that family members still sought his counsel on important decisions. Intercepted phone calls suggested ongoing involvement in family affairs. The prosecution painted a picture of a boss who had officially retired but continued pulling strings from Arizona. Bonanno's defense team argued that their client was an old man being persecuted for past associations. They portrayed him as a legitimate businessman who had left criminal activity behind decades ago. The government, they claimed, was engaging in a vendetta against an Italian-American who had never been convicted of a serious crime. The jury struggled with the case. After lengthy deliberations, they convicted Bonanno on conspiracy charges. In 1980, Judge William Ingram sentenced the 75-year-old former boss to 1 year in prison. Bonanno served his time at the Federal Correctional Institution in Bastrop, Texas. For a man who commanded fear and respect throughout the underworld, prison was a humiliating end. But even behind bars, the old boss maintained his dignity. He refused to cooperate with authorities, adhering to omertà even as many younger mobsters were breaking that sacred code. Released in 1981, Bonanno returned to Arizona. His health was failing. He had suffered multiple heart attacks and other ailments. His criminal empire had long since passed to new leadership. The Bonanno crime family continued operating, but under bosses who barely knew the founder. The world Bonanno had known was dying. The old Sicilian traditions that governed his life were becoming irrelevant. The younger generation of mobsters cared nothing for the codes of honor. They cooperated with federal authorities, testified against their former associates, and entered witness protection programs. The omertà that Bonanno held sacred was breaking down. His son Bill had been forced out of the family's operations entirely, convicted in 1985 of various crimes, and essentially exiled from the underworld. The Bonanno family itself was in chaos, torn apart by internal conflicts and federal prosecutions. In 1983, Bonanno made a surprising decision. He would write his autobiography. Titled A Man of Honor, the book would tell his version of the Mafia's history and his role in it. It was an unprecedented move. Bosses didn't write memoirs. They didn't discuss the honored society publicly. But Bonanno, ever the independent thinker, decided the old rules no longer applied. A Man of Honor appeared in 1983 and became a bestseller. In it, Bonanno presented himself as a man of principle who had lived by a code of honor in a dishonorable world. He claimed he had never sold drugs, never ordered unnecessary violence, and always adhered to Sicilian traditions of loyalty and respect. The book infuriated many in law enforcement and organized crime alike. FBI agents pointed to the sanitized version of events, noting Bonanno conveniently omitted his most ruthless actions. Rival mobsters were angry that he had discussed the Mafia at all, even if he revealed few specific secrets. But the public was fascinated. Here was a real Mafia boss, still alive, telling his story. Americans consumed the book eagerly, mixing truth and myth in their understanding of organized crime. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Bonanno lived quietly in Arizona. He watched as RICO prosecutions devastated the crime families he had helped create. John Gotti, boss of the Gambino family, was convicted in 1992. Commission trials in the mid-1980s sent numerous bosses to prison for life. The FBI and prosecutors were systematically dismantling the American Mafia. Bonanno's own family was in shambles. A series of weak bosses and internal conflicts had reduced it to a shadow of its former power. The family that once controlled territories from New York to Arizona now struggled to maintain relevance in a changing underworld, increasingly dominated by Russian, Asian, and Latin American criminal organizations. Joe Bonanno, who had attended the foundational meetings of the commission in the 1930s, who had helped create the structure of the modern American Mafia, now watched it crumble from a distance. But he would outlive them all. Part 6. The Last of the Old World. The 1990s dawned with the American Mafia in retreat. The golden age of organized crime had passed. Federal prosecutions had devastated the five families. Dozens of bosses, underbosses, and soldiers sat in federal prisons serving life sentences. The code of omertà had shattered. Mobsters were cooperating with authorities in unprecedented numbers. Joe Bonanno observed these developments from his home in Tucson. Now in his 80s, he had outlived nearly everyone from his era. Lucky Luciano had died in 1962. Vito Genovese died in prison in 1969. Carlo Gambino, the powerful boss who had helped force Bonanno into retirement, died of natural causes in 1976. Even Bonanno's cousin, Stefano Magaddino, who had turned against him during the Banana War, was long dead. Bonanno was the last of the Mustache Petes, the old-school Sicilian bosses who had built the American Mafia in the early 20th century. He represented a dying breed, men who valued tradition, honor codes, and the old Sicilian ways. The younger generation running the families in the 1990s were American-born, more business-oriented, and far less romantic about the honored society. In 1999, the Bonanno crime family suffered a particularly devastating blow. Federal prosecutors convicted numerous members in a massive RICO case. The family's acting boss and several key captains received long prison sentences. The prosecution revealed that the Bonanno family had been heavily infiltrated by FBI informants and undercover agents. Joe Bonanno watched these events from a distance, but they must have troubled him deeply. The family bearing his name, the organization he had led for over 3 decades, was being destroyed. And unlike the enemies he had faced in his prime, these adversaries couldn't be intimidated or eliminated. The full power of the federal government was arrayed against the Mafia, and the Mafia was losing. Despite his advanced age and health problems, Bonanno remained mentally sharp. He followed current events and maintained contact with family members. He avoided discussing criminal matters, knowing that federal surveillance continued even though he was ancient and officially retired. In his final years, Bonanno became something of an anachronism, a living link to a vanished era. Journalists occasionally sought interviews, though he rarely granted them. Historians and authors studying organized crime wanted his perspective on the events he had witnessed and shaped. But Bonanno remained loyal to omertà in his own way. While he had written his autobiography and discussed general principles of the honored society, he never testified against anyone. He never cooperated with law enforcement. He never named names or provided evidence that could be used in prosecutions. This silence, maintained throughout his life, was perhaps his most consistent adherence to the code he claimed to honor. His family life brought both joy and sorrow. His wife Fay remained devoted to him until her death in 1980. His sons had given him grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But Bill's legal troubles and exile from the underworld surely pained him. The dream of establishing a dynasty had failed. There would be no Bonanno family legacy passed through legitimate generations as he had once hoped. As the new millennium approached, Joe Bonanno's health continued declining. He suffered from various ailments related to advanced age and his earlier heart problems. But he remained in his home, surrounded by family, refusing to die in a hospital or institution. The world had changed beyond recognition from the one Bonanno entered in 1924. The Brooklyn neighborhoods where he had built his empire were gentrified, inhabited by young professionals who knew nothing of the bloody history that had unfolded on their streets. The Italian immigrants who had formed the backbone of the Mafia had been replaced by new waves of immigrants from different countries, bringing their own criminal organizations. Technology had transformed law enforcement's capabilities. The wiretaps and surveillance that once required significant resources could now be deployed routinely. RICO laws allowed prosecutors to charge entire organizations. The Witness Protection Program encouraged defection. DNA evidence and electronic tracking made it increasingly difficult to commit crimes without leaving traces. The old Sicilian Mafia's power in Italy itself had been severely weakened by prosecutions and social changes. The codes and traditions that Bonanno had learned in his youth in Castellammare del Golfo were largely forgotten, replaced by more brutal and less romantic forms of organized crime. On May 11, 2002, Bonanno died in his sleep in his home in Tucson, Arizona. He was 97 years old, having outlived every other major figure from organized crime's golden age. Unlike many of his contemporaries who had died violently, shot in restaurants, strangled in basements, bombed in their cars, Bonanno achieved what few mob bosses ever did. He died peacefully, from natural causes, surrounded by family. His death received significant media coverage. Newspapers published obituaries that tried to capture the scope of his life and influence. Some portrayed him as a romanticized figure from a bygone era. Others emphasized his role in organized crime and the violence he had authorized or committed. The funeral was private, attended by family members and a few close associates. No current mob figures appeared. Most were either in prison or avoiding anything that might draw federal attention. It was a quiet end for a man who once commanded one of America's most powerful criminal organizations. Part 7. Legacy of Honor and Violence. Joe Bonanno's death closed a chapter in American criminal history, but it opened debates about his legacy that continue to this day. Was he a man of honor, as he claimed, or simply a ruthless criminal who sanitized his own history? The answer, like Bonanno himself, is complex and contradictory. In his autobiography and public statements, Bonanno presented himself as a traditionalist who adhered to Sicilian codes of honor. He claimed he opposed drug trafficking on moral grounds. He insisted he only used violence when necessary and according to the rules of the honored society. He portrayed the Mafia as a positive force that helped Italian immigrants establish themselves in America. Law enforcement tells a different story. FBI files documented Bonanno's involvement in numerous criminal enterprises. Former associates who broke omertà described murders he ordered, businesses he extorted, and violence he authorized. The man of honor was also a man who built his empire through fear, intimidation, and blood. The truth likely contains elements of both narratives. Bonanno genuinely believed in certain principles: loyalty, family, maintaining one's word. But he applied these principles selectively and within a framework that justified criminal behavior. He could be generous to friends while ruthless to enemies. He could preach honor while ordering murders. His impact on American organized crime is undeniable. As one of the youngest bosses appointed during the restructuring after the Castellammarese War, Bonanno helped shape the modern American Mafia. The commission structure that he participated in creating lasted for decades. The five families model of organizing New York's underworld proved remarkably resilient. The Bonanno crime family itself survived its founder by 2 decades, though in increasingly diminished form. After Joe Bonanno's death, the family continued operating under various bosses. Joseph Massino became boss in the 1990s and rebuilt the family's power, only to become the first sitting boss to cooperate with federal authorities in 2004, a betrayal that would have been unthinkable in Bonanno's era. The family's current status is uncertain. Federal prosecutions have continued, and the organization that once rivaled the Gambinos and Genoveses in power is now considered one of the weaker of the five families. Whether it will survive another generation is questionable. Beyond the specific family bearing his name, Bonanno influenced how Americans understand organized crime. His autobiography, despite its self-serving elements, provided rare insights into mafia culture and history. It shaped public perception of mob life, influencing countless books, movies, and television shows. The Godfather trilogy, Goodfellas, The Sopranos, and numerous other cultural touchstones drew inspiration from the world Bonanno inhabited and described. The romanticized image of the Mafia as an organization of honor-bound men following old codes owes much to Bonanno's self-presentation, even as the reality was far more brutal and mercenary. His longevity itself became part of his legend. Dying at 97 of natural causes while most of his contemporaries died violently or in prison seemed to validate his claims about the superiority of his approach. Perhaps, some suggested, adhering to the old codes really did provide protection. Or perhaps Bonanno was simply lucky and smart enough to know when to fight and when to retreat. The Banana War of the 1960s, while damaging to Bonanno's power, ultimately demonstrated his survival skills. He faced the combined opposition of the Commission and most major crime families, yet he survived. His strategic disappearance and eventual negotiated retirement showed a pragmatism that served him better than stubborn pride would have. His son Bill wrote his own book, Bound by Honor, which provided another perspective on the Bonanno family history. The son's account largely supported the father's version of events, though it also revealed some of the costs of that life: the constant fear, the family separations, the inability to trust anyone completely. Joe Bonanno's legacy raises uncomfortable questions about American society. How did organized crime become so powerful? Why did the Mafia thrive for so many decades? Part of the answer lies in the discrimination and limited opportunities faced by Italian immigrants in the early 20th century. Men like Bonanno found paths to wealth and respect in the underworld that were blocked to them in legitimate society. Prohibition, perhaps more than any other factor, enabled the Mafia's rise. By criminalizing alcohol, the U.S. government created a massive black market that enriched criminal organizations and gave them the resources to corrupt law enforcement and politicians. The Mafia's power during Prohibition laid the foundation for its dominance in subsequent decades. Bonanno also benefited from law enforcement's initial refusal to acknowledge the Mafia's existence. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover famously denied there was such a thing as organized crime until the Appalachian meeting forced him to admit the truth. This willful blindness gave mobsters years to establish themselves without serious federal interference. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of Bonanno's legacy is how he remained largely untouched by justice throughout his life. Despite decades of criminal activity, he spent less than 2 years total in prison. 1 year for the 1980 obstruction of justice conviction. He was never convicted of murder, racketeering, drug trafficking, or any of the serious crimes he almost certainly committed or ordered. This failure of justice bothered law enforcement agents who had devoted careers to investigating Bonanno. They knew what he had done. They understood his role in organized crime. But they could never build the case that would put him away permanently. Part 8. The End of an Era. Joe Bonanno's story is inseparable from the larger story of the American Mafia's rise and fall. When he arrived in America in 1924, organized crime was fragmented and disorganized. When he died in 2002, federal prosecutions had reduced the once mighty 5 families to shadows of their former power. The world Bonanno entered as a young immigrant was one of opportunity and danger. Prohibition created wealth for those willing to break the law. The Italian communities in New York, Boston, Chicago, and other cities provided recruitment pools and protective environments. The old Sicilian traditions of omertà and the honored society adapted to American circumstances, creating something new, the American Mafia. Bonanno was present at the creation of this organization. He attended the meetings where the commission was formed. He helped establish the territorial divisions that would govern New York's underworld for generations. He participated in the transition from the old Mustache Pete leadership to the more Americanized gangsters like Lucky Luciano. But Bonanno also represented the past. Unlike Luciano, who was willing to work with Jewish and Irish criminals, Bonanno remained a Sicilian traditionalist. Unlike Carlo Gambino, who maintained a low profile and avoided publicity, Bonanno wrote an autobiography that openly discussed the Mafia. Unlike Paul Castellano, who ran the Gambino family like a corporation, Bonanno clung to the personal honor codes of his youth. This tension between old and new, between Sicilian traditions and American pragmatism, defined Bonanno's career. It led to the Banana War, as younger, more Americanized bosses tried to force him out. It led to his exile in Arizona, where he could maintain his dignity while losing his power. It led ultimately to his irrelevance as the Mafia evolved beyond the codes he held sacred. The irony is that Bonanno outlasted all his critics and rivals. The bosses who forced him into retirement are long dead. The families that opposed him have been devastated by prosecutions. The old commission structure has largely collapsed. Yet Joe Bonanno died peacefully at an advanced age, having written his memoirs and secured his version of history. What are we to make of this man? He was undeniably a criminal who profited from vice, violence, and exploitation. He ordered murders and authorized violence. He corrupted legitimate businesses and labor unions. He built his fortune by preying on human weaknesses, gambling addiction, loan desperation, the demand for illegal goods and services. Yet he was also a product of his time and circumstances. He arrived in America as a young man fleeing fascist persecution. He found opportunities blocked by discrimination and limited by his immigrant status. The underworld offered what legitimate society denied: respect, wealth, and power. Bonanno genuinely believed in certain principles, even if we might question how he applied them. He valued loyalty and punished betrayal. He believed in maintaining his word, at least to those he considered equals. He took care of his family and those loyal to him. These qualities might be admirable in a different context, but in the service of organized crime, they enabled exploitation and violence. His relationship with violence was complex. Unlike some mob bosses who seemed to enjoy brutality, Bonanno approached violence pragmatically. He used it as a tool of control and deterrence. The stories of his involvement in murders come largely from informants and FBI reports, rather than direct evidence. He was never convicted of a violent crime. Whether this reflects his innocence or his cleverness in insulating himself from direct involvement remains debated. The question of honor haunts Bonanno's legacy. He titled his autobiography "A Man of Honor" and insisted throughout his life that he lived by a code of honor. But whose honor? The Sicilian traditions he claimed to follow also included murder, extortion, and revenge. Can there be honor in a life dedicated to crime? Perhaps the most accurate assessment is that Bonanno had his own concept of honor, one that allowed him to commit crimes while maintaining his self-respect. This required certain mental compartmentalization, separating his role as a crime boss from his identity as a father, husband, and community member. He could attend church on Sunday while ordering a murder on Monday, because in his mind these belonged to different moral spheres. The end of Bonanno's era came not from rival gangsters, but from fundamental changes in American society and law enforcement. RICO laws gave prosecutors tools to target entire organizations rather than individual criminals. Electronic surveillance made secret meetings impossible. The Witness Protection Program encouraged cooperation by offering safety to informants. Younger mobsters, less committed to omertà than Bonanno's generation, chose self-preservation over code. The mafia that Bonanno helped build couldn't survive these changes. It was too dependent on secrecy, too vulnerable to defections, too out of step with modern law enforcement capabilities. The old codes that governed Bonanno's world proved inadequate for the new reality. Today, the American Mafia exists as a diminished force, still capable of criminal activity, but far from the power it wielded in Bonanno's prime. The five families survive in name, but their membership is decimated, their profits reduced, their influence minimal. New criminal organizations, Russian, Asian, Latin American, have filled many of the niches the Italian Mafia once controlled. Joe Bonanno died as the last significant link to the Mafia's founding era. With his death, an entire chapter of American criminal history closed. The old Sicilian traditions he valued have largely disappeared. The codes of honor he claimed to follow are mostly forgotten.